Welcome to the UO Today podcast, conversations that offer a glimpse into the heart of the humanities at the University of Oregon. Listen as our faculty, students, and guests introduce ideas and research that help us reflect on the past, navigate the present, and imagine possible futures. I'm Leah Middlebrook, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Isabel García Valdivia, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Oregon. Professor García Valdivia's research focuses on immigrants and their families. She's working on a manuscript on the late adulthood experiences of immigrants. Her first solo-authored article, Legal Power in Action: How Latinx Adult Children Mitigate the Effects of Parents' Legal Status, which was published in the journal Social Problems, won student paper awards from the Society for the Study of Social Problems and the American Sociological Association. Professor García Valdivia was formerly a postdoctoral fellow at the Population Studies and Training Center at Brown University and a UC President's postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Sociology at UCLA. She joined the UO faculty in 2024. Professor García Valdivia, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Leah.
Tell us a little about your background.
My academic background or my upbringing, or both?
Tell us about the background you feel like sharing with the UO Today audience.
Thank you. Yes, so a little bit about my background is, one, I'm a child of immigrants, which I think is very relevant to why I became interested in understanding the impact of immigration policy and just immigration generally in the US, and understanding how it impacts families as well as individuals. Broadly speaking, this started way before I even went to grad school. In undergrad, I think, some of my first research projects looking at how DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, began while I was an undergrad. So looking at the experiences of those students who were able to get DACA, which included some temporary protections against deportation and work permits, and those who were unable to get it. So I did a comparison study trying to understand their experiences, but many times when I began doing those interviews, a lot of students would talk about their families and how beyond that moment, there was long histories of struggling to fit in, even if they maybe themselves had other siblings who were citizens, often younger siblings, etc. So that just sparked my curiosity in looking not just individuals, but also families and at different life stages. At that time, I was looking at undergrad students. Later on, I started doing research on more older immigrants and middle-aged immigrants. And that's what I continue to do today. I'm trying to understand how they navigate US bureaucracy, social institutions, inclusion, exclusion in the US context.
I am so interested in this decision you've made to work on slightly older immigrants, because I feel like very often we're focused on the experiences of children. Can you talk a little bit more about the decision to work on those groups?
Yes. So it actually was from that article you just mentioned, Legal Power in Action, that in those interviews, I interviewed both young adults and their parents. So there were dyads in that research. And when I was talking to the parents, they often discussed fears of what would happen to them and what it implied to their children when they got older and were unable to work. Because at that time, most of the parents were still working, but they were reaching their late 50s and 60s. And so they knew, given the life course, that at some point they were not going to be able to work. And many of them were working in strenuous jobs. So they had a lot of body aches, physical body aches that they worried about, because they're like, I'm going to become a burden to my children, which now are adult children. At that time, they were the adult children, but they're like, I'm going to become a burden. And I don't want to become a burden. I want to know what I can do. Is there anything I can do? Is there something I should be thinking about now before I can't work anymore? So that sparked my interest. So that paper was like, oh, what do we actually know about older immigrants? And there are a lot of studies on older immigrants, but there's a lot of heterogeneity because it just depends. There's a lot of immigrants in the US. The US is an immigrant community. But the big difference I think that's arising now is that there's a demographic shift where a lot of the immigrants who are aging have more precarious immigration statuses because we've created a system, an immigration system that's super complex over the last 30, 40 years, that there are immigrants that are aging without a legal status, which we never really had before. So it's a very particular case. And even those with status, if they were ever undocumented, which many have been undocumented at some point of life, maybe they were restricted from contributing to Social Security, which means they have less hours compared to other similar age adults. So that's one. Two, those who are undocumented, even if they have contributed to the system, which we know undocumented immigrants do contribute to Social Security, Medicare taxes, and taxes in general of all kinds, sales, property, et cetera, et cetera. They won't see those benefits, even if they have contributed locally, at the state level, and federal for the most part, given how our immigration policy has started to exclude since the 1980s and 90s. A lot of new immigrants, even legal immigrants, are excluded from certain benefits.
This is such interesting and timely work. I'm really glad we get the chance to talk about it today, and I'm so glad that you're on our faculty at UO. Can you tell us some about what you wrote in your dissertation, what your research was for the dissertation?
Yes, for the research, I did a comparison study. So, for example, I did not just interview older immigrants that live in the U.S., particularly in Northern California. I also returned to Mexico, to a traditional Sunny state in Jalisco, in the Altos area, to interview return migrants, but older immigrants that returned to retire, quotation marks, I'll say, in Mexico, because I received questions while I was doing interviews in the US from others like, well, don't older immigrants just get sick and go die in their home country, especially Mexican immigrants who is the population that my study focuses on particularly. And I didn't have a clear answer. I saw the research from what past research said. So I went to do interviews in Mexico with those that had returned. Well, and some things that I found that were interesting was, well, one, it was harder to find older immigrants that returned in old age. There were many immigrants who had migrated at some point to the US, but then that returned in the 30s, 40s, etc. But I particularly was only interviewing those that had returned after they were 50. Why 50 is because a lot of the research on older populations, independent of immigration status, starts looking at older adults over 50 because of health diseases, etc. Like the Health and Retirement Survey here in the US and its sister, the Mexican Retirement Survey too. They all start at 50 because of illnesses that start to arise around that age, like chronic illnesses. And what I found, it was that usually those that returned were those who had assets, like in the US. They were not the low income immigrants. It was usually those immigrants that had immigration status that could move between both countries, even if they preferred to live in one country or the other, which often they lived the majority of the time in Mexico, but then they came back to the US to visit their grandkids, to visit their children, to do their taxes, because they're like, yes, I go every year during tax season to do my taxes, or to check on my house, or visit family, or to renew my license, or any bureaucratic often or family matter that they had to take care of. But they limited their time of spending in the US and returned to Mexico often. I found less older adults that were undocumented, that returned as undocumented adults, which it was interesting to see that, because here in the US, undocumented older adults I spoke to often said like they felt stuck here because if they decided to leave, it was a permanent decision. And many of them had not returned to their home country, Mexico, in more than 15, 20, 25 years. So they felt that they didn't know it personally because they haven't been traveling back and forth. But they also felt that they knew, because of technological advances, they could see things on the internet. They had maybe, WhatsApp, video calls, etc. They saw, but they didn't know how it had changed in those 15, 20, 25 years. So they were afraid. They many a time discussed that they knew how the US worked. And by how US worked is like they were accustomed to the laws, to how you went to work, where they went bought their food, their friends, their colleagues, etc. They had built communities in the US that felt more safe because that's what they knew.
This is so interesting. What projects are you working on now? How has this work developed post graduate school and as you
Yeah.
embark on
So
your professor career?
So I'm working on the manuscript for this research. It has changed, which I've done some follow-up interviews, especially because some of my data was right before the start of the pandemic. So I did follow-up interviews to see how the pandemic had impacted, especially return migrants. And like many came back to the US to get the vaccines, those who had immigration status, because they were available in the US before were available in other places, etc. So that's like a follow-up that I've been working on. And then I'm also working on a new collaborative project with a colleague at Brown University, which we're looking at how the experiences of undocumented grad students that already graduated and their experiences in the labor force. So looking at for those undocumented graduate students who have graduated, what their experiences have been integrated or not into the labor force. Because we do have a lot of focus on more like undergrad college students, et cetera, and especially when we look at immigrant students, but we know less about grad students. And that's, we are defining it broadly for grad students like PhDs, masters, MSW, law school, medical school, business school, etc. So we're actually in the data collection status right now for that project. And we're very excited to see what we find.
So am I. You mentioned the impact of the pandemic. Are there any sort of stories you can share or any striking cases that have come up for you?
Well, sadly, some of our participants did pass away given the pandemic due to COVID-19. They fell ill due to different health vulnerabilities. So that was something that I had to think about and I'm still thinking of how it will be incorporated into the book manuscript. And others findings. I mean, for return migrants, I thought it's super fascinating to see how those who are legal immigrants who live pretty much like 11.5 months out of the year in Mexico and then just come back to visit family maybe like 2 weeks a year, etc. How they would come back to the US during the pandemic. Many of them lived in the Bay Area, so the Bay Area was one of the areas in the US um, that was closed down for the like longest compared to the rest of the nation. So they would come back to get their vaccine, to isolate. Although many of them discussed that given where they were living in Mexico, it was already more isolated. They weren't living in big urban areas, which we know a lot of return migrants that are younger move to Mexican urban areas for work. But they themselves they returned to Mexico to retire, so they're not necessarily living in urban areas. So they felt sometimes it was safer to be out in more rural areas than it was to be in other places, both in Mexico and in the US. But when they're in the US, they also felt pretty safe given that they were in the Bay Area. And it was a pretty, the Bay Area was the longest area to mass, to have things closed down, etc.
So interesting.
Mhm.
How do you conduct your research?
This research or these two research projects are qualitative research projects. So a lot of it involves first building ties to communities because you can't just go into a community and like start interviewing people, etc. It's like you have to build trust, and especially since I've been always interested in questions about immigration status and the law, etc. Um, so oftentimes, like with the first project, I was volunteering, I was calling out bingo, uh, I was helping people fill out forms, volunteering. I was going to church um, in the early hours. I was showing my face and being present and listening beyond just conducting interviews. Um, and the same goes with the current project we're doing with undocumented grad students who've are no longer grad students. It's like you have to create the networks, going to organizations that cater to these populations, having discussions, creating trust with communities. Um, because interviews can vary a lot, depending on the topic and context, but they get very, in my mind, like I don't want to say emotional, but they can get heavy.
Mhm.
And you learn a lot of like in interviews, a lot of like background history, not just what people are experiencing or how they see the world today, but also of like past factors that have impacted where people are now. So I think that that is both, I feel privileged, because I feel like people feel confident and comfortable sharing that, as a researcher, but then I also um, feel it's a responsibility as a researcher to make sure to portray the stories accurately, and also um, to think about how it fits like within my like sociological lens and like what we know already in theory. So it's like balancing those two things.
Can you tell us more about the concept of a sociological lens? I think that would be an interesting topic to explore a little bit.
Yeah, so when I think of sociological lens is like unlike psychology that really focuses on the individual, I think of it like when I'm thinking of every interview and then also the collective interviews, um, is like how do they fit in what we know about how different societal institutions work or don't work? Which for me, a lot of because I do migration, et cetera, I look at different kind of institutions and how they're embedded within one and another. So, like, oh, wait, how does the family structure? How is it embedded within a larger community structure? What's the larger environment of like policy here because of immigration? Or policy, politics, media. Media is a very hot one of like trying to think like individuals are not just acting as individuals, but they're acting within a system of larger forces that they're embedded. They believe certain things because of what they've been exposed more broadly. And every person can be like really in a different environment. So thinking of like, what does that tell? Like, what does each participant's story tell me about broader sociological forces? Like, what does it tell me about the family? What does it tell me about law? What is it telling me about bigger structures versus just saying like, person A or X person said this, and that means this. It's like, no, it's like, well, how's that connected to the larger institutions? And like really thinking of like, is it an individual thing? Is it a societal? Is it like a lot of inequality? Like, what is it? Like, how can we connect this individual experience to larger trends that we see? um, which sometimes I like to use both also quantitative research and demographic data and survey to kind of see like, well, we see this data is telling us this broad phenomenon, social phenomenon is happening, but doesn't explain why, or it doesn't explain the mechanisms. So then interview data is really rich with that because interview gives us the stories and really lets us say like, we know this is happening in society, but like how is it happening? So what are the mechanisms? And then we as humans, we need stories. Stories is what we understand. It's how we can resonate with people. It's how we can have empathy, not have empathy to people. It's through stories.
Tell us some about the classes that you teach.
Yes, well, this term actually I'm teaching Ages of Immigration, which is like an introductory sociology of immigration class that takes time, both thinking broadly as like demographic time, life course, um, and also historical context time, to look at the everything from like why people migrate, to the policies specifically to the U.S. historically on immigrants and immigrant reception. And then we end with more focusing at the stories at different life stages. So we have like young, like children, then we have like young adulthood, and then we have stories about like different immigrant groups from different racial backgrounds and their migration into the US at different life stages. We have the late adulthood, so we look at a couple of readings about like late adulthood experiences as immigrants. But then we also look at topics like undocumented migration, labor migration into the US, etc. So that's one of the courses I'm teaching, and the other one is Latinx in Contemporary Society, which really is a sociology of Latino studies. And it focuses at looking at the experiences of the US Latinx population, and looking at different areas from gender, politics, and how this population has developed over time in the US, but also the very distinct experiences depending on the different ethnic groups within the Latinx population, the historical context of the relationships of the US with Latin America, which I think is super relevant to what's happening in the world today.
Absolutely. Is that last one a graduate course or is it an undergraduate course?
It's an undergrad and also it's a
Oh,
400, 500 level. So it's
yeah, it's both.
both. Yeah, so it's both. Um, And I have a lot of fun with that course because I like to bring a lot of like current events because there's always, anytime you're teaching it, I have found, and I've taught it multiple times now, but there's always current events. And students love that. For both classes, they love when we can bring what's happening in the world into the classroom to understand theories that they're learning about. And those are like the substance course, but I also teach another like figure, race, and ethnicity class, and I do research methods.
Terrific. I've seen that you've written that mentorship is really important to you. Can you talk a little bit about mentorship?
Yes, so I've been very fortunate, I think, in my academic career since I can remember. And I'll just give you an example. Like, I still write letters to my sixth grade English teacher. I literally received one yesterday, for the holidays. And it's because she has been a major mentor for me. I grew up in a Spanish speaking home, but I was never in an ESL class, or English for Spanish learners, because I tested out, which I don't know how I did it, but I did it at some point back in the day. But she was one of the first teachers, and it's in sixth grade, that she tried to bring culturally relevant experiences to class. And I always remember that she would get books and encourage us, and she would get like bilingual books and or books that talked about like different cultural experiences. I remember her really purchasing books, and I remember Esperanza Rising at that time was like new, and that
Yeah.
was a book that she bought, and she was like, you should read it, like this, I think you'd enjoy it, etc. Because there was a diverse student population at that time, and it was growing. It was a shift during the time when I was growing up, and she was on top of it, and she was a good mentor, kept mentoring me through high school, college, grad school. We've been in contact since still am as a professor now. Now she's retired. She's no longer a sixth grade teacher. So that has followed me through. She and other mentors like that have followed me through. And I felt that they always taught me the way. As a first gen student, my parents did not go to school in the US, so they did not know how to navigate the US educational system. So it was these mentors at different steps that taught me, like, okay, now you're in high school. This is how you apply to college. This is how you apply to scholarships. And not that they necessarily told me, it's that I would seek mentors. I would seek people that knew information that I didn't know and that my parents didn't know. And my parents also were very encouraging. They would say, ask questions. I'm like, as your teacher, as your counselor. I was in a college readiness program in high school that I would go once a month to. I'm from Illinois, so we would go to different schools in the Chicagoland area, universities, and learn about applying to college since I was a freshman in high school. And that helped me expose me to different types of colleges, universities. Then I went to a small liberal arts school in Southern California, Pomona College. And that's a small learning environment where I got direct mentorship from faculty, both in sociology and in Chicanx Latinx studies. So I have always learned from like people who've done it before me, and then asked a lot of questions. I think you always have to find your people. I don't think we can do anything by ourselves. I think it's a myth to think that people do things by themselves. Because I don't think I've ever done anything by myself without like asking for help, in the sense of, and I don't mean help like they sit here and help me, but like they tell me like their advice, or like, oh, you should maybe do it this way. At the end, I have to do the work. But um, I think that mentorship has played a key role for me to be here, and for me to feel like I've been successful in my academic journey.
What kinds of things do you say to some of your undergraduates to encourage them to reach out to their professors? It's always that hurdle, right, to get a student to come to office hours and begin to
Yeah,
engage.
yes, definitely. I think I always tell students, well, one, it depends on if they're like first, second, third, fourth years, but especially if they're earlier on. And I hope, and I also repeat it later on, but I hope to get them early on. It's like office hours are not just to ask questions about the subject matter of the course. You can, like, I try to demystify what office hours can be used for. I'm like, office hours can also be used like you just want to meet your professor, you want to introduce yourself to the professor, or you just want to ask the professor about their research or something of interest of the class. But I think many students have the conception you only go to office hours if you need help. And many times I'm like, no, you don't need to go to office hours just because you need help, and or just to have a conversation with faculty members. So I always encourage students to go. Depending on my classes, it depends on class size. I make it often a requirement that they have to
Hmm.
come into my office hours at least once in the term. Um, it's more doable with smaller classes, not as doable with large classes, given the limited time. But I really think that helps. And because I feel like it encourages some students that maybe didn't ever think that they could just go to office hours just to chat versus needing help and assistance. But I think some larger advice, I think to advisees and students, I tell all the time is like ask a lot of questions. Find people that are doing something you're interested in. And just ask them like, well, why do you do this? How are you doing this? How did you get involved with this? What does your day to day look like beyond professors? Also, like thinking of careers or even using your fellow peers. I learned also a lot of like from peer mentors from some of my peers that were just 1 or 2 years older than me. And they're like, oh, take classes with this professor or apply to this fellowship, apply to this internship, etc. You learned about different opportunities through networks. Um, and we humans are very social, like by nature. So I think that that is also a reason that we can learn. Networks are very important, and sometimes putting ourselves in uncomfortable, um, and maybe in an uncomfortable place. So, for example, for me, I'm like, oh, if I'm feeling uncomfortable, it means probably I'm learning, and I'm like, and I need to sit with this uncomfortable sensations. But then I know that at some point, I'll look back at it and say, oh, it was good that you put yourself out there, or that maybe you did something that was out of your comfort zone. Because you've grown and now it's easier. Or now you're like, oh, that opened up other doors, whether that's academic, career wise, or even just interpersonal. Um, it teaches things can teach us lessons, even fear and being uncomfortable.
That's so great. Yeah, I hear a lot, and I've read a fair amount. I'm sure you've seen it too, that one of the tolls of the pandemic was that so many people just lost their ability to sit with that discomfort of being in a room with other people you don't know, and so that's so great that you're reaching out that way.
No, I think the pandemic has taught us a lot of lessons. One that like we're social people, and then not having the ability to be social has really impacted a lot of mental health. Except like social skills, I think it also depends on the age. So thinking life
Hmm.
course, like which
Yep.
developmental stages, and it affects different groups for in different ways depending on that. Um, and I think the pandemic would like brought it like front and center, and like and even the post pandemic, which we
Yeah.
are post pandemic, um, I think has really brought that to light. Even I see it with students, I see it with peers, um, or even how we've come back to like social life. I think has changed too, like what's acceptable and what's not.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I'm glad to know that sociologists are thinking about it.
Yes.
What are some things you like about living in Eugene?
The weather, because I'm from the Midwest. But I will say I've lived in many places now, so I think the weather is pretty. I don't want to say calm, but like predictable. That I can like okay, I can predict the weather in the summer, in the winter, and it's not like the extremes.
Hmm.
Which I lived in different types of extremes, from winters to heat, etc. So then I really enjoy that. I think it's very green, and that's something I think this when I was visiting my family for break, I would talk to them. I'm like, yeah, like, Dad, you would really love it. It's like super green. You can be in the city within city as in Portland within a little bit over under 2 hours. I'm like, but you can also be in the mountains or you can be in the coast. Um, and depending on the time of the year, you can be in like multiple places in one day.
Hmm.
So I think
Hmm.
that's really amazing um, because it's not a lot of places in the US. Having grown up in the Midwest, we had plains, we didn't have mountains. We had Lake Michigan, uh, a big lake, but we also had extreme weathers. So then I think that's what I always come back to. And I'm like, I really like that here it's predictable. There's, yes, right now it's winter, so there's a lot of rain, but there's not like big snowstorms, not at least in Eugene.
Not this year, not yet.
Yeah, not yet. Hopefully.
Oh, I've so enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you for having me.
I've been speaking with Isabel Garcia Valdivia, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Oregon. Our Research Notes segment helps us keep current on recent developments in University of Oregon faculty and student humanities research, such as the book we will be discussing today, A Woman's Empire, Russian Women and Imperial Expansion in Asia, by Dr. Katya Hokanson, which was published at the University of Toronto Press in 2022. Katya Hokanson is a professor of Russian and comparative literature in the Schnitzer School of Global Studies and Languages at the University of Oregon. She's also the head of the comparative literature department at the University of Oregon. Katya, thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. Very nice of you to invite me.
Tell us a little bit about your research focus.
I would say that my longstanding interest has been in sort of imperialism in Russian literature and culture in the 19th century, and I started out writing about Russian sort of romantic writers who coincided, the sort of Russian romantic period coincided with their takeover of the Caucasus region, which was kind of Russia's Orient. And so they followed a lot of romantic conventions and even sometimes plot lines and other kinds of things, but created their own version of these texts and poetry. And that's still regarded as kind of as the foundational golden age texts. They also later became more critical when people like Tolstoy decided, for example, to write about his own experience when he was in the military in the Caucasus and then in Sevastopol in the Crimea. That was kind of the genesis of his anti-war feelings, which became more and more expressed later on. So it's sort of this cradle of Russian literature at the same time, but it's also this moment of Russian expansion into its southern regions. So the two kind of go hand in hand. So what happened with my book project is that I expanded it in a new way.
And tell us about that. Tell us about the book, A Woman's Empire. And congratulations, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. Um, so the new one is basically once the Russians had they had taken when the Russians were in the Caucasus, they actually had unified resistance to them under Shamil the Circassian, who had a sort of a somewhat Islamic, he was an imam, but he had an Islamic protest against the Russians, which was very powerful for quite a while. But finally, he was taken prisoner, and the main organized conflict ended in the early 1860s. And so in 1865, then sort of having all this apparatus and all of this military that was very experienced, Russia then decided to go into Central Asia. I mean, they had been previously, but they went for it sort of in all seriousness. And interestingly, there, because there wasn't the same sort of population, there wasn't the same sort of organized resistance. They went very quickly and took huge chunks of Central Asia and were already done sort of by the mid 70s. They had taken a lot. Well, into the 80s, but compared to like over 60 years in the Caucasus, it was much quicker. So I just became interested in, well, how did the Russians write about that particular expansion? And there it was not very literary. It was there was some literature that it was primarily kind of ethnography, science, travel literature, all of those kinds of things. It was more documentary in certain ways. And then I just became interested in, okay, there's a lot of stuff that people have written about men writing about Central Asia, but nothing really about women writing about Central Asia. So I went into I was interested in sort of, the women writers, women travelers, family members of officials, and family members of ethnographers and scientists. A couple of the women were scientists in their own right. Most of them were either fellow travelers or attached in some way. And sort of together they provided this kind of fuller picture of Russian aims, processes, and self-identity. So that was what I explored in the book.
Can you give us a few names and a few juicy anecdotes?
Yes. So one woman was, they kind of contrasted. There was one woman who was she was the wife of a general, someone who became a general at 36 in the Caucasus. Then they moved to Central Asia, sort of further and further away from the center. And she had to be sort of the wife of the governor general or the wife of whoever it was. And she kind of liked that if that involved things like music or writing. But if she had to sort of, represent by going to teas and dinners and things like that, she became very frustrated by that. But she was very into her status for sure. Then you had someone like Olga Fedchenko, who was a real botanist, and she went very early on in the 1860s with her husband, where they had to be sort of protected by guards, and they were starting to try to sort of explore all these areas that were new to the Russians, obviously not new to the people who lived there. And she was someone who was kind of pressed into service because she was seen as less threatening. She would do some of their compass measurements and things like that so that people didn't get worried about them. But they were kind of, that was early on, and they were under danger of attack many times. But they also interestingly judged her. We don't have as much of her own writing, but we have other people's writing about her and how she was sort of judged that if she sort of provided tea and things like that in the tent for the others, then that was considered to be extremely positive. So the women had to sort of both go on these various adventures and like ride horseback for hours and hours and hours a day. You couldn't do any of this without riding horseback a lot. But then they were supposed to be sort of feminine, and they were supposed to follow some of the conventions of kind of polite society. Most of them were upper classes, in the upper classes. Although Olga Fedchenko actually had two siblings who were protesting Russia's autocracy, and one of them went to Siberia for doing that. So she was in that sort of milieu where there were people really thinking about a lot of things. Um,
That is
One person is
fascinating.
very, very somewhat outlandish, which is Madame Blavatsky, who she really wasn't in Central Asia, although she defended Russia's in Central Asia. But I write about her travelogue to India, which is partly imaginative and imaginary, partly real. She was a very vocal opponent of British imperialism and the way the British treated the Indians, but she was just fine with how the Russians treated the Central Asians and thought that, they really needed to go there and impose civilization. So she was very forgiving of Russian colonialism, and she was very unforgiving of British colonialism. So she was quite an interesting, and she just was a very good writer. She writes all sorts of interesting things, and she was also unusually, she would always make a lot of the body, how difficult it was to go places, things that were hard, things that when she had to be carried, that things that often, as Mary Pratt wrote about some years ago, right? There's very often this sort of disembodied traveler's eye. They never talk about the practicalities. Blavatsky talks about the practicalities all the time. Anyway, so she's kind of one of the more colorful characters.
This sounds so interesting. I really look forward to reading the book. What makes a woman's empire important to humanity?
Mhm. I would say that to me anyway, it's interesting or important because it kind of investigates the methodology and the effects of colonialism by figures who themselves were not necessarily authoritative and could sort of see the fissures and the shortcomings of the rhetoric that was employed. It showed what women attempted and achieved at a time when it was becoming possible to do that. But they also, I think, noticed things that often didn't get noticed, and they were used, and this is talked about in a lot of different areas in terms of travels. That they were the people who could go in and talk to women when women were cloistered, or in some sort of a harem or some sort of a restricted space. They could go in and talk to women, but they also then, by that same token, got to meet women, got to have food that women cooked, got to think about, they talk about the clothing that they wore. So there was, and I think they just noticed, and they all noticed, most of the women that I read also really noticed how Russian women, especially Russian peasant women, suffered kind of in comparison with people in Central Asia, just because there was so much alcoholism in Russia, there was so much inequality, there were so many difficulties with a kind of everyday life, and they saw that people had sort of arranged their life differently and better, not just in Muslim areas, but in Buddhist areas, in shamanistic areas, right? And because some of these were Mongolia, some of these were Buryatia, so these were not places that were just Muslim by any means. So there were a lot of things I think that getting this women's perspective, not that they were not colonialists, because they were, but there's things that you see and notice because of who's observing and who's experiencing.
Fascinating, really interesting. Where can our listeners learn more about these topics?
Well, it's a little tricky. There's not a lot written about women. There's a lot of books on Russia and Central Asia. There's a good book called Russian Empires by Grigor, Ron Suny and Valerie Kivelson. There's books by Jeff Sahedo and Alexander Morrison that are about kind of the history of Central Asia or Russia in Central Asia in the 19th century. Um, there is one about the ethnographer Maria Nalivkina, which is called Muslim Women of the Fergana Valley, which is edited by Marianne Kamp, Kamp, and that she partly edits the reports of this woman and her husband who lived with people and observed. They're kind of like ethnographers who lived, participant observers. And so
Mhm.
there's those memoirs are edited and translated into English. So those are maybe the most accessible. And also Doukhovskaya, the woman who was the wife of the official that I mentioned early on, her memoirs are available in English. Diary of a Russian Lady. But most texts, and I've been asked by a lot of scholars, where can I find this in English? It's like there's one woman who's actually a writer that I didn't mention, and she writes a lot of interesting stories. A lot of them don't center on Russians; they center on local people. But none of her work is available in English, so most of them you have to read Russian, basically. Or
I
there's a
have
little bit of Fedchenko. She wrote a little bit in German, so.
I have a feeling that these remarks are going to spawn, a lot of really interesting projects from you and perhaps from interested graduate students who are thinking, oh, that's something to do.
It's possible. I hope so. I mean, I learned a tremendous amount doing it, and I found it very interesting. And so, yeah, I'll be thrilled if someone wants to pick up the baton and do more.
Well, thank you for telling us a bit about A Woman's Empire, Russian Women and Imperial Expansion in Asia, which came out with the University of Toronto Press in 2022. And it was just a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was very enjoyable.
I've been speaking with Katya Hokanson, a professor of Russian and comparative literature in the Schnitzer School of Global Studies and Languages at the University of Oregon and head of the comparative literature department.
Our Undergraduate Perspectives segment features the voices of up-and-coming UO undergraduate humanities researchers who bring the vibrancy of their work into view and into hearing for the UO and our wider community. Let's take a listen.
In the basement of the history building in my junior year of college as an English major, I learned how to use a semicolon. The research I did came from that moment, in a way. Other English majors and I are writers. We write in every English class. We write for fun. We write to express ourselves, to argue, and to improve our skills. But we noticed that very few of our classes actually focused on our own writing. If I hadn't taken a writing minor or gone above and beyond the English degree requirements, I would only have taken a single writing class more than a math major. But I became an English major to learn how to write. So once my thesis advisor introduced me to composition studies, an entire discipline that focuses on the practice and teaching of writing, I knew what I wanted to do for my thesis. I wanted to have an impact. So, after a lot of emailing and finding an appropriately secluded set of rooms in the back corners of the library, I was able to sit down and talk with successful English majors that were both being taught and teaching within the department as student writing tutors. Even though I only interviewed 6 tutors, each one had interesting and detailed insights into their own classroom experiences and the tutoring processes they were engaged in. I asked them semi-structured interview questions, leaving room to follow up and dig into the information and thoughts they had that I knew was relevant. Some interviews were shorter than others, with the longest interview being close to 45 minutes, and as a whole, they had a lot to say. I found that writing tutors in the English department are doing a lot of work, not only sitting down across from students to help with their writing, but translating assignment instructions, filling gaps in communication with instructors, and offering lessons and insights into missing or neglected writing knowledge. While writing itself isn't currently prioritized in the English degree program, the writing tutors, the composition program, and minor programs in the department are working to provide that kind of education from beyond the spotlight. I hope that my research can inform decision makers in the English department from a student perspective as they work to improve and more closely align the degree requirements with what they say their priorities are on their website, like critical thinking, written and spoken communication, and research skills. I am very grateful to my mentors in the English department and the Oregon Humanities Center for helping me complete this project and being good sports about it. I'm hopeful that my research will prove useful both to them and to other English majors in the future.
UO Today is a production of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Thanks for listening.